Hi guys. Sorry if you keep getting notifications. I'm going live. Still learning. But I hope you're having a good Tuesday. I know that the January test is coming up. So if you are studying for the January test, good luck. If you're listening to me, some random person, talk about the LSAT, then I already know you're going to do just great, because half of the LSAT is going out and finding the explanations and the answers that make sense to you. And if you're listening to me on YouTube or you found me on TikTok, that obviously means you're looking for explanations and answers. And that's really what it takes for the LSAT. But let me know if you are studying for the test or thinking about studying. And if you have any questions about law school in general, feel free to put them in the chat. What I thought I would do today, because I went live earlier on TikTok, and I posted that live already. So if you haven't seen that and want to see me go over cause and effect questions, and I talk about necessary and sufficient conditions, and also weaken and strengthen. So that was from this morning or this afternoon. So I recommend checking that out after this live. But I wanted to do something maybe a little bit different over here on YouTube. And I just wanted to show my TikTok, because I have a lot of really good tips, I think, on my TikTok, really good examples. And then I just thought I would talk through my thoughts on the question type. So what type of patterns I've noticed. And this is what I do with my students before they take the test, because drilling and doing practice exams can wear on you. And a lot of my students, in the days leading up to the exam, they start to feel more stressed out and more anxious. And then if they get one question wrong, it almost becomes a spiral. Oh no, the test is coming up, and I'm not doing as well as I was doing before. I feel like I'm getting worse. And 9 times out of 10, it's literally just nerves and stress that's messing with them. And then adrenaline kicks in on test day. So if that's you, or you can relate to that, just know that's totally normal. It's just part of having a really hard test. So yeah, I thought I would just scroll through my TikTok and talk about some of these posts I made. So for necessary and sufficient conditions, I actually think this is a good post. Let me see if I can. Whoa, what's happening? Okay. Oh, I didn't know it was a video. Okay. So, can I make the pause go away? Not really. Well, okay. This is me learning. There we go. Okay. So, necessary and sufficient conditions don't have to be I think the way people explain them is really confusing. But this is one example. Actually, this is a pretty good example. It's one that I've used with my students. But you can see that conditional language is indicated by if then. And well, that's one way it can be indicated. That's the easiest way to think of necessary and sufficient conditions. And you can tell from the little example I have there that the sufficient condition comes after the if, and the necessary condition comes after the then. And so here in this example, I wrote, if you are a sophomore, then you must register on Tuesday. So if introduces a sufficient condition, so being a sophomore is the sufficient condition. The necessary condition comes after then, and the necessary condition is registering on Tuesday. So the sufficient condition is being a sophomore. The necessary condition is registering on Tuesday. Why is registering on Tuesday the necessary condition? It's the thing that is required. So one way that you can figure out what's the necessary condition is to ask yourself in the sentence, what do they say is required? What do they say is necessary or has to happen? Any synonym of necessary can signal a necessary condition. So for example, here it's saying you must register on Tuesday. Well, the must is giving us a requirement. So the requirement is the necessary condition. The sufficient condition is being a sophomore. If we talk about what the difference between sufficient and necessary condition is, the difference is in how much it tells you. So when I say that, in this scenario here, if I tell you I'm a sophomore, you know something about me already. You know I have to register on Tuesday, if you know this rule. So the sufficient condition, which is being a sophomore, if I tell you I'm a sophomore, that tells you the whole story. It tells you both the sufficient and the necessary condition. Because if I'm a sophomore, that means I have to register on Tuesday. So you know two things about me with the sufficient condition. You know I'm a sophomore, and you also know that means I have to register on Tuesday. The necessary condition does not tell you anything. And this is where the LSAT loves to trick students. And this is what it means when you see answer choices that say like confuses a sufficient condition for a necessary or the other way around. What I'm about to explain is that mistake. The necessary condition does not tell you anything. The necessary condition by itself only tells you that the necessary condition happened. So in my example here, if I go up to you and I don't tell you I'm a sophomore, but if I just tell you I have to register on Tuesday, that doesn't mean I am a sophomore. Maybe juniors also have to register on Tuesday. Maybe seniors also have to register on Tuesday. Registering on Tuesday is not the sufficient condition. It doesn't tell the whole story. If it said only sophomores must register on Tuesday, that would be different. But this just says, if you are a sophomore, then you must register on Tuesday. And then this last bit at the bottom, I actually think is a really good hack. So let's say you can't tell if it's conditional language, or you can tell, but it's confusing. you try to reword the sentence into an if-then sentence. When I say that, I also mean that when you get sentences that say things like all or any, never, none, every, anything very absolute like that, anything absolute like that you get, you are getting conditional language. So in this sentence, and I know it's kind of blocked over, but it's okay. If it had said all sophomores register on Tuesday, that means the same exact thing as if you are a sophomore, then you must register on Tuesday. Those mean the same thing. And they both have conditional language. When it says all sophomores register on Tuesday, the way we can figure out necessary sufficient condition is by changing that into an if-then sentence. So, if I'm a sophomore, I register on Tuesday. If introduces the sufficient condition, so being a sophomore is the sufficient condition. So, be on the lookout for if-thens, but also know that conditional language applies whenever you're getting something that's like a hard, strict rule that says every, any, all, none, never. Anytime you're getting something like that, try to put it into an if-then sentence in your head or on paper, and then identify what the necessary and sufficient is. So when there's a flaw that says they confuse the necessary for the sufficient or the sufficient for the necessary, what it means is they're getting these two flipped. So for example, if I told you that I have to register for classes on Tuesday, we already talked about how that doesn't tell you I'm a sophomore, because maybe juniors also register on Tuesday. But what the LSAT will do is they will make that mistake in the stimulus. So they will say, oh, because you registered on Tuesday, that must mean LSAT machine is a sophomore. And then they'll ask in the STEM, what is the flaw in the reasoning? And your answer choice is going to sound like confuses a necessary condition for a sufficient condition. Or like mistakes a necessary condition for a sufficient condition. So I think the most important part with conditional language is, one, being able to recognize it, and two, knowing how the LSAT describes it. And so if we look at, I don't know actually what is next. What's the next one here? Okay. So, necessary conditions. So let's say, this is a really good example because it's one that we all know. Let's say if it is human, then it must be a mammal. Okay. And we know that that's true in life, in the world, in the real world. It means that if it's human, then it must be a mammal. Because all humans are mammals, right? We have that strong language again. all humans are mammals. If you are a human, then you are a mammal. Remember, if introduces sufficient condition, then introduces the necessary condition. So here, the necessary condition is being a mammal. It comes after the then. Another way to think about it is that it's required if you're a human. You can't be a human and not a mammal. It's literally impossible. If you are a human, you are a mammal. So mammal is a necessary condition. And being human is your sufficient condition. And remember that I said the sufficient condition tells you the whole story. So again, if I tell you, hey, I am a human, you know two things about me right away. You know, one, I'm a human. And you know, two, I'm also a mammal. Because all humans are mammals. Because if it is a human, then it is a mammal. So if I tell you the sufficient condition, you know the necessary has happened. But let's say I tell you just the necessary condition. If I come up to you and I say, hey, Bob is a mammal, that does not mean Bob is a human. Being a mammal is necessary to being human, but it is not sufficient. And so this is a good example of when the necessary condition does not tell you anything. And this one's a little bit more intuitive, because if I just tell you Bob is a mammal, that necessary condition only tells you one thing: Bob's a mammal. You can't make any other inferences or conclusions off of that. Bob could be a cat, Bob could be a lion, Bob could be a monkey, Bob could be like a million things. He doesn't have to be a human. So that mistake, if you were to say, oh, he must be human, that would be confusing a necessary condition for a sufficient one. Because you're confusing the necessary, being a mammal, for the sufficient condition. And that reminds me, this just popped in my head, another very common answer choice that trips students up is one where it will say, treats a condition as necessary to bring around a conclusion when in fact it is sufficient or to reach a conclusion. It was kind of clunky wording, but it's always it shows up like mistakes something as being necessary for something else to happen, for being sufficient for that thing to happen. And that long-winded, like convoluted wording is really common. So it's super common that they'll say, it mistakes like a condition to be sufficient to bring around a conclusion that in which the argument, and it will just go on and on. But if the core idea is mistaking the necessary for the sufficient or the sufficient for the necessary, then that's your answer choice. And then this last bit kind of ties into assumptions. But if you want to test whether something is necessary, you want to make it false. If you make it false, then the conclusion cannot happen. Because remember, the whole point of a necessary condition is to be necessary. So that means the conclusion cannot happen without it. So here, if I were to tell you that the necessary condition is false, the necessary condition is being a mammal. If I tell you I'm not a mammal, you know there's no way I can be a human. And that passes the test. If you make the necessary condition, the mammal, false, you can't even get to the conclusion, which would be human. Yeah. I think I have one more. Yes. And so this is another example of this specific flaw of mistaking the necessary for the sufficient. So let's say this example. It says the job requires a bachelor's degree. Now remember, I've been saying that the necessary condition is the thing that's required, the thing that must happen. So here is pretty clear. The thing that's required is a BA. So the bachelor's degree is necessary because it's required to get the job. The sufficient condition is getting the job. So if I tell you, hey, LSAT machine, I got that job that requires a bachelor's degree, you know two things about me. You know I got the job, and you know I have a bachelor's degree. But the necessary condition, which is having a bachelor's degree, if I go up to you and I say, hey, I'm LSAT machine, I have a bachelor's degree, that does not mean that I got the job. It's one requirement. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to get me the job. So when you see an answer choice that talks about mistaking a necessary condition for a sufficient condition, this is a pretty good example of that. And when I say like this is a good example, I don't mean like this is a good example to learn and forget. I mean, this is a good example to like hold on to and pull out on test day when you get a really freaking confusing example. Because you're going to get a sentence that says like the blah 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 historical poetry social movement required a perspective of history from which blah 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 blah. It's not going to make sense. At least, okay, I shouldn't say that. I am positive you geniuses out there, it will make sense to you. Me, that type of stuff goes in one ear out the other. But what I do notice is when I see the word requires. Because I know that is a pattern, and it's going to be the same exact pattern as the job requires a bachelor's degree. No matter how long or how complicated those words are on either side of the word requires, no matter what, the necessary condition comes after the word requires. And the sufficient condition comes before the word requires. And then that helps you notice when the flaw is mistaking a necessary condition for a sufficient. And you can see that in this example here. What that would look like is saying, if I have a BA, if I have a bachelor's degree, I'll get the job. That is not true, because the necessary condition, which is having a bachelor's degree, does not get you the job. It's necessary, but it is not sufficient. If I tell you I get the job, though, if I tell you the sufficient condition, then you know the whole story. You know that I have to have a bachelor's degree. Okay, well, if you're catching this on replay, let me know in the comments. Make sure you subscribe and you turn on notifications for when I go live. I didn't get any viewers, so I'm gonna end a little bit early because I'm the type of person who needs some encouragement. But make sure you catch the next live if you can, and make sure you follow me on TikTok because I go live there too. If this was helpful, like I said, let me know in the comments. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and let me know if you're studying for the LSAT. All right, it was great talking to you guys. I wish you good luck if you're taking the January test. Make sure you get yourself some rest and relaxation in too. And I hope that this helped clear up conditions for you. All right, have a good rest of your day, guys. Bye.